Hey, I wanted to do a video on how to fire harden a house. Most bug out locations are going to be in the wildland urban interface. The National Forest Service defines that as one or more buildings on a density of 40 acres. This is probably a lot less than that. It's probably more like one building on like 60 square miles. But in any event, I wanted to show you a few things to do that so that you can understand the codes. Now, there's four fundamental codes. One's a UL standard that's rarely looked at, but the other ones, the main one that's used in California is California Building Code Chapter 7A. It's probably the gold standard, very strict. The International Code Council has the International Wildland Urban Interface Code. It's the one that's most widely adopted, and then there's NFPA 1144. I think now the most current version has morphed into NFPA 1140. But I wanted to talk about it because I went through those standards and codes as far as building the structure or renovating it to ensure I was fire hardened. And what that means is when you're in the wildland urban interface, you're subject to wildland fires. And the flora and fauna of the wildland evolved for, naturally adapted to wildland fires every 3 to 10 years on average. So what the National Forest Service's policy was throughout the 20th century, basically for the last 170 years, has been to suppress fires. And what that's done is it's fundamentally altered the geometry and loading of combustibles in the wildland setting. So that's created situations where wildland fires are permitted to burn much more severe, hotter, longer, do more destructive damage. Now, this area, if you look around, it clearly is not like your national forest environment. You don't have trees. This is what I believe it's the ICC Wildland Urban Interface defines as what's called Model T fuels. It's Great Basin sagebrush. It's a medium combustible loading, but there's a caveat attached to that. What the Wildland Urban Interface Code does is it ups that from a medium fuel load to an extreme hazard if you have more than 8 extreme weather days a year. And this place, you have NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It issues more than 8 red flag warning days a year. So this is an extreme fire hazard zone. So that's the backstory. So let's go through the code requirements for that kind of a zone. What would happen in a fire situation if you had a relative humidity, say like 8%, you're 95 degrees Fahrenheit, you're blowing at like 40 miles per hour, you will see massive tornadoes of fire tornadoes out in the wildland, and you'd see embers lofted well ahead of the fire lines, more than a mile, in fact, in many instances. And what happens from those embers that are lofted up, they land, especially with the sagebrush ignited, the velocity of the uplifting force of the wind will pull those pieces of sagebrush up in the atmosphere. And it'll loft it in such a way that it remains burning when it makes contact a mile ahead of the flame front. So that's how spot fires occur. And what you have with situations with extreme wildland fire events is those spot fires then result in multiple structural fires. And when you have multiple structures on fires, it limits the response capability of your first responders. And that's what results in a conflagration. You have multiple homes on fire and there's nothing you can do about it. So you got to get ahead of the curve on that, your bug out location. You got to prepare for that. A lot of people around here would be like Island Park and Sun Valley. They have nice cabins in the pines, but the reality is they failed to prepare their structure for wildland fire. So take a look here. You have a deck. I built that deck recently, but I've not put skirting around it. Skirting is a requirement for all decks. NFPA 1144 requires it. Another thing that both NFPA 1144 and the IWUI code require is ignition-resistant siding. The California Building Code actually goes farther than that. It actually specs out a specific fire resistance rating. So what you'd see is behind siding like this is like a ½ inch of gypsum. Now I put the standing seam metal on instead of vinyl. I thought about vinyl, but I wanted something impervious to sparks. So behind this, I installed 1½ inches of insulation, standard expanded foam insulation. And then what I did is I completely encased that foam in steel. So all the way up, soffits, all the way down, it's completely encased so that there's no way that sparks could get into that. The other thing I did here is up on top, the IWUI code allows a 1/4 inch gaps in your mesh, your screen, no more than a 1/4 inch. 1144 requires 1/8, no more than 1/8 inch. I'm about a 1/4 inch. And just for your awareness, if you look at the International Mechanical Code, it specs out mesh between a 1/4 and 1/2 for air intakes, for HVAC, things like that. So there's kind of a code dichotomy if you ever went 1/8. If you have area that's sucking in as an air intake, kind of problematic. Another thing that's important to know in the Wildland Urban Interface, you're required by the IWUI code to have tempered glass. Your glass needs to be tempered, or it needs to be a 20-minute fire-resistant rated glass. 1144 doesn't have that requirements. All my windows are double paned, so there's some really good research in terms of fire endurance between single and double pane. It's like 4 times longer with double pane. It's really impressive, the difference. Another thing to consider is the IWUI code requires 50 feet of offset between structures, between an occupiable house like this and an outbuilding, unless that outbuilding has fire-resistant construction. 1144 says 30 feet. And if you look over here, what I did on that structure there, that's my solar power shed. I actually specifically designed and built a shed that had a 50-degree profile on it so I could mount panels and have my battery room in there in a warm environment. But as you can see, I'm actually 50 feet away, and that's the reasoning behind it. And that way, if there ever was something that happened on that shed, even though it's protected by steel encased siding, it's not going to ignite and take out this house through radiant exposure. It's just not going to happen. Now, with that said, take a look at where I built my greenhouse. Now, I was kind of constrained in terms of locations, but I clearly do not meet the 30-foot requirement there. But there's an allowance, and that is polycarbonate has dynamite fire resistance. If you consider like Douglas fir, consider building a campfire. And what you have are some Douglas fir logs. If you look at the actual laboratory data on Douglas fir, it actually gives off as much energy as it required to take in to sustain combustion. And that's why you have to have logs together for it to continuously burn. Other materials actually give out a lot more than they need. Polycarbonate is interesting because what polycarbonate does is it takes 50% more energy from exposures to continue burning is what it puts out. It's very efficient. There's a chart that actually demonstrates this. You can see that there's a lot of differences in current terms of performance for fire-rated versus non-fire-rated materials. So the other thing I wanted to talk about are boundaries. The 100-foot rule. So the IWUI code requires you to have a defensible space around your structure in the wildland urban interface of 100 feet. But one piece of that here that I've poorly demonstrated is from the first 5 feet here away from a structure needs to be non-combustible, or it needs to be resilient enough to avoid ignition from embers. So, well-watered grass would work. Succulents would work. A lot of people use like gravel and a rock landscape, and it's something I need to do there. I'm not too worried about it because even if I ignite things here, keep in mind that the deck's new, because of the metal siding, it's really going to be fairly resilient against fire. The other thing I wanted to point out are eaves. This is an important issue here. If you look up on top, I use corrugated metal, and there's little openings here. Let's get a little closer to that. If you look, you can see there's openings up here. Now, I used a corrugated steel on purlins rather than a flat standing seam for my roof. If I used a standing seam, kind of like what I did on my siding here or over in that power shed, there wouldn't be that gap. Now, there's a lot of ways you can fill that gap. In a wildland setting, the California Building Code, for instance, requires that gap filled, Chapter 7A. And what you can do, you could use mortar, a variety of items that you can just fill that gap so embers can't blow into it. Now, in my case, I had what's considered a Class B roof, a fairly robust roof on top of there. It needed to be replaced. So what I did is I laid 2x4s down horizontally in the length direction of the structure, and I separated those by 2 feet, so 2 foot in centers, and then I put the corrugated metal on there. So even if an ember blew under there, it wouldn't have the capacity to penetrate. And how roofing is classified, Class A, Class B, Class C, I think it's IBC Chapter 14. It has to do with building a fire on top of a sloped roof and finding out how far it spreads, and it fails if it burns through the structure. So in this case, I'm fairly comfortable. I don't have any accumulations of pine needles, things like that. But if you were building in a wildland urban interface next to pines, firs, that kind of thing, what you'd want to do if you're using a metal roof and you went with corrugated, you'd want to go through and you'd want to fill all those holes. Something else you'll notice, and that's required by code, in addition to just non-combustible exteriors, is to keep all soffits and eaves sealed. Not only do you want to avoid bird and bee infestations, but you want to prevent any kind of locations from having an area where embers can blow in. Here I went with a vented soffit up there, but the reality is I'm really tight everywhere. There's no way that embers can blow in, so it keeps things very safe. So here's just a few steps I wanted to talk to you about. You can see I'm very defensible. There's nothing here. It's all just graded out. So if a fire came rolling in, I have very good defensive areas. Fire is going to hit it. It's going to probably go through the lighter, very shallow grass, sparse grass, but it's going to self-extinguish. I'm not worried about it. A very very safe and defensible location. In addition, I have 500 gallons of water in a cistern that can be used to assist in extinguishing any fires. But I wanted to show you that. I think it's smart having a feel at your bug out location. People put so much time and energy and money into their bug out locations, and they don't think about, well, are you resilient enough to withstand, the end of the world? Sure, maybe you are, but what about a natural event such as a wildland fire? That'll take out your bug out location so fast. So it's smart to just, prepare with some basics. And I think the things that I've shared with you are beneficial. Anyway, hey, I appreciate your time. I hope you have a good day, and thanks for watching. Have a good one.